Welcome to the Maritime 101 session brought to you by the Maritime Business Chamber. Maritime 101 session, Shipping Disruptions webinar brought to you by the Maritime Business Chamber.
Greetings to everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Maritime 101, which will delve into a discussion around the disruptions within, the shipping industry itself. Just to give a brief introduction as to the session itself, as we all know, since October 19th, 2023, there has been a series of activities that have been taking place with regards to the disruptions that have happened around, the Red Sea for those vessels that were going via the Suez Canal. And ever since then, there's been a number of activities. I think Dr. Elaz, today you were saying, I'm not sure whether it's day 74 or day 76 in that regard, since this activity has taken place. This has disrupted, shipping, whilst we were still looking at the challenge that is being faced, one, by the disruptions within the Black Seas and also the Panama Canal. I was in another session earlier on where they were saying, whilst these disruptions are very critical and they affect, quite a lot of things, but this is not as big as what happened during, COVID-19, the pandemic itself, and also the time with Ever Given. But the experts will dive into that and give us, a clear direction as to that as we delve into this discussion today. I would then hand over to Mr. Evans, whom is going to take us through, the program itself, with engaging with our three esteemed speakers that would be sharing knowledge around these matters. We are hoping that by the end of this session, we would all be aligned and we would know exactly what needs to be done and how this is affecting shipping internationally. I would then hand over to Mr. Evans, whom is going to drive us and take us through this process. Obviously, this session is an industry dialogue that has been driven by the Maritime Business Chamber, an organization that is based in South Africa, an organization that has positioned itself as the voice of industry around the issues of policy, around the issues of lobbying, with the main focus around also the inclusion of small businesses within maritime activities as well. I would now hand over to Mr. Evans to take us through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Unathi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening all. What we're going to do is a quick kind of round of introductions amongst ourselves on the call, and then also when we introduce ourselves, maybe present our views on the kind of current landscape as it stands today. So as I said, I'm Mike Evans, Director of the Risk Intelligence Centre at Securitas, otherwise known as the RIC, because hey, every good intelligence outfit needs a three-letter acronym in its name. And we support customers in all different industries and sectors, including in shipping and maritime, in response to the global threat landscape, both as it stands today and indeed as it's going to be shaping up in the future. And as we kind of led off today, the landscape for shipping and maritime is a very dynamic one at this point in time, with lots of choke points, quite literally, as it stands. And it's really important to understand what those choke points mean for us today from an impact perspective, but also the secondary and tertiary order effects of these. So if we're seeing disruptions, for example, around the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, what does that now mean for shipping and maritime industry as a whole, but particularly in context of today's webinar for South Africa and the Horn of Africa? So that's a little bit about me. What we'll do, gentlemen and ladies, is if we kind of pass around amongst ourselves, quick introduction, and I'll say who and when type of thing, just to make sure we have some order of madness on a webinar, right? Introduce yourself and maybe present a little bit of a view of what you see in terms of the landscape today. So we'll start with Dr. Mariritim, please.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here. First of all, I'm very honored to have been invited here by the Maritime Business Chamber of South Africa. I've got a personal, a strong, long-standing connection with South Africa, and I've been deployed with the German Navy to South Africa years ago, 2008, and I've been back there several times, and so it's for me it's a very special case to be here, even though it's just a digital invitation. But pretty soon I'll be in South Africa physically as well, and I'm also highly honored because of this Maritime Business Chamber cooperation or the invitation here, because I think there's a strong potential to rejuvenate the long-standing ties in the maritime domain between Germany and South Africa. So I'm very happy to be here. And then saying a little bit about myself, I'm now 41 years old. I've been in the German Navy for over 20 years. I've sailed on several warships, surface warships mostly. I've studied nautical sciences as an officer in the German Navy, so I've got a civilian mariner's license as well. I've been on merchant vessels. I've been deployed on German warships to United Nations mission UNIFIL off the coast of Lebanon. So one of the hotspots we are going to discuss today, basically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the time, was already something, of course, very long-standing issue, and I've been there as part of the UN force. I've been then later deployed to the Horn of Africa in the European Union mission Atalanta and counter-piracy with a German frigate. And after these experiences, I went back into academia, studied war studies at King's College London, did my PhD a few years later. So that basically took me to this mix of personal, professional background, experience on the ground, on ships, in the maritime industry and in the naval domain, and also the academic level of research and expertise, which I've now forged into a private enterprise together with a co-founder in December last year. So still very fresh. Our company Next Maris, which embarks on this endeavor to offer a fresh view, a holistic view on maritime security, based on resilience, not just defending against potential threats, but rather making the whole organism more capable of handling stress and disruptions in whatever form they may come, and also in not just looking at security threats, but also safety issues and sustainability issues. So I'm very happy to be here and add that a little bit to this crisis we're currently looking at, because I think it has a much wider implication than just for the sailors who are most immediately threatened, who are being targeted in the Red Sea, but it also has ramifications, of course, for the global economy, but also in the region and in terms of global power dynamics, competition between the great powers. So there are many levels that are worthwhile looking into, and I'm very happy to do that. And a systemic way of looking at this, not just at individual parts, but as this whole challenge, as a system, as part of a larger challenge, but also opportunities, and also for each individual who deals with it, be it a company, be it a state, whichever organization we wish to look at. I think it's worthwhile taking this holistic, systematic view, and that's what we stand for. So thanks very much for having me here today.
Thank you. Great. Turning over to Mr. Abdul Rahman, introduce yourself and a little bit of a view of where you see the landscape today, good sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Evans, and thank you everyone for having me here. Thank you for the Maritime Chamber of South Africa, and I'm very privileged to be alongside experts, distinguished Dr. Jensen and Dr. Brick. I've been in the industry in the Middle East, I would say, for the past 20 years. So I have been, I've seen some fair share of disruptions, I would say, in this region. And luckily, I've been involved in all kinds of maritime business because, as you see these days, even over the media and over social media, the focus is usually on the container business because that's the fair share of what cargo is being moved around the world. However, being in this industry and covering all aspects of maritime shipping, such as cruise shipping, ro-ro, freight forwarding, and doing some kind of consultancy also for the port authorities, I've had an overview of the situation from my perspective. And it's very important that we're here today because it's important to finally have a voice from the Red Sea. I mean, all the media has been talking about the disruptions at a global level or the problems between Asia, Europe, Asia, and the US, but no one has been speaking enough about what's going on actually in the Red Sea and the economies that are being supported by those ports in the Red Sea. That's number one. Regarding my view, I would rather prefer to leave it until the end of the session. However, to start with, I do have a feeling in this region, or let's say not only me, maybe a huge part of this region has a feeling that not enough is being done to actually resolve the crisis in the Red Sea. And as have you seen in the news developing lately, and as Mr. Santi has said today when he started, the situation does not really look as scary as everybody thought it would be at the beginning. And this has given a lot of, I would say, the superpowers of the world have been very relaxed about resolving this disruption. However, we hope that this session would actually remove any doubts about this, and we can actually tackle exactly what's going on in our region from our perspective.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Lars Jensen.
Yeah, thanks. And also thank you very much for inviting me to come on here. My focus is singularly on the container shipping business. So the ro-ros and cruise ships and tankers and bulkers, I will leave to other capable people to comment on. I'll stick purely to the container shipping part. I've been doing that now for 23 years, ever since I took over the crystal ball in Maersk as chief analyst, and then for the past 12 years have been doing this independently. I basically just see myself as I'm always trying to look around the corner and see what's coming next. In terms of my view, I would to some degree echo what we have already heard here. I think if you read press headlines, both in the shipping press and in the popular press, the current crisis is completely misunderstood. It is not a crisis. It is, sure, it's a challenge. It will cost some money. It takes some time, but it's not a major problem, not like what we saw during the pandemic. At least not when this is viewed from, let's say, the developed countries up in Europe and North America. On the other hand, what I feel has been completely forgotten is the enormously detrimental impact this has not only on parts of the Arabian Peninsula, but most particularly the part that concerns me the most is in Ethiopia, which could be the last of the large Sahel countries to be completely destabilized with massive ramifications for the region. I feel that is going completely unnoticed. Focus is on the shipping lines, as if this was a problem. The shipping lines have become profitable because of this. This is good news for the shipping lines. It's not bad news.
Fab. Thank you very, very much. So Moritz, you said something at the kind of top of the call that was really quite interesting, and that was, we need to approach the current challenges, and note the word challenges instead of the word crisis, right? Because I think we're in broad and general agreement here that we're facing challenges and choke points, quite literally, but we're not facing a crisis as we were during COVID. But how can we in the industry approach this in a systemic way? What would that approach look like?
I think what Lars just said is very important to keep in mind. We're not just talking about a disruption of shipping lines, as noticeable as these are. They create major costs, and there are effects tangible. You know, here, I mean, I'm calling from Germany today, so we've had shutdowns of major industrial sites, of disruptions of supply chains, which led to people being laid off work or hastening the economic pressure that already is building because of the war in Ukraine and the aftermath of the COVID crisis. So we're having an already not very stable economic environment, which then gets this on top. So there is an effect certainly tangible. But if you look at this in a systematic way, or look at the bigger picture, so to speak, then you first of all have to realize this is not an accident. We're not just dealing with the Ever Given scenario again, but we are looking at major geopolitical actors causing a disruption here, which doesn't just attack shipping. It's also a major test in the challenge and competition between Russia, Iran, via the Houthis as a proxy against the West, with at least a tacit backing of the Chinese in one way or another as they back Russia. So there is a situation here where a major global challenge is focusing in this situation here, which may lead to further disruptions, or disruptions which we notice, be it in Ethiopia or other parts. Egypt is another such country where this is definitely part of the overall plan. It's intentional. So the West has to deal with this challenge. Europe has to deal with this challenge and not be distracted by missiles striking merchant vessels. As important as this is, the bigger picture needs to be kept in mind, and including other countries as well. So it's not in the national interest of many countries in Africa or in Arabia that these disruptions continue, because they actually lead to, I think, a very noticeable danger of solidification of blocks. Because of these attacks, certain trade structures will become more favorable than others, and an already existing competition between, let's say, East and West is in one way or another being supported by these attacks and builds or supports the building of blocks. So that is something that cannot be in the interest of many countries, which are now basically in between. Where do they align with?
Thank you. I mean, that's looking at a very big, wide scope of the global events and how these different center of gravities, being the Red Sea, and overlap with other center of gravities like the Panama Canal, etc., create this disruption. So looking at that globally, becoming let's go local, let's go to immediate focus. Mr. Abdulrahman, how do you view that, and how do you think that we can approach overcoming these challenges in a systematic way within the industry?
Thank you again. Well, first of all, if you look at it locally from our perspective, there are always alternative for those routes that were actually coming into, I would say, Aqaba from my perspective, I would say. However, you have to look at the economies that those ports support and see how resilient they are before we look at those alternative routes, because those alternative routes they face us with other challenges like logistical challenges, additional costs, space issues. Then you've got something that a lot of people have not really noticed, even the shipping lines, which is documentation issues, including invoicing, packing lists, as far as inspection reports, all kinds of logistical challenges that importers and exporters have to navigate now that they have to look for alternative routes. However, at the same time, this also provides an opportunity for the local importers and exporters to diversify their supply chains, which was very important during the COVID-19 days. And whoever did not diversify at that time basically went out of business. And that experience had taught a lot of businesses, whether locally or even regionally in the Middle East, not to rely 100%, I would say, on Far Eastern origins, and maybe also diversify in Europe and the US to navigate such challenges when they happen. So I believe that for this challenge, and I would say challenge, as Dr. Jensen just said, and not a crisis, and for this challenge in particular, I think we are doing much better than we did last time because of the experience we have accumulated during the COVID-19. And I would also even mention that even the government locally, whether in Jordan, Egypt, or the affected countries, have also learned from the COVID-19 experience. They have tackled the challenges they have at the moment very wisely and without a lot of noise, which shows that they did actually learn a lot from the COVID-19 experience and other disruptions. Again, as I said, in the Middle East, you're faced with disruptions every year. We had military conflicts, we had border issues, we had blockades, and a lot of other challenges in the past, which has taught us enough about supply chain resilience that we can overcome. But one last point, however, is that for countries like Jordan, I would say, which has no other alternative port, like for example in Saudi, they have alternatives in Dammam or in the eastern side of Saudi Arabia, where even though it would still impact the port in Jeddah, however, they still have other alternative ports that would support their economies. Same thing in Egypt. But for example, in Jordan, we only have one seaport, which is Aqaba, supporting our economy. And there's a risk that after this challenge is over, people would actually might adapt to other alternative routes, which would impact our economy in the long run.
Thank you. And on that, it's a really good point about the fact that we've got that one key port within Jordan, and that speaks to what Dr. Lars, you were talking about earlier in relation to Ethiopia, in that whilst that's being very much under the radar right now, if that becomes a problem, it very quickly goes from being a challenge, which we're currently experiencing on a global level, to being a critical kind of flashpoint of threat and disruption. With that in mind, how can the industry, at both a global view and that critical view at a local level, approach these challenges? What can be done at this point in time?
You can say I see an industry, and this goes both for the global container lines, also for a lot of the regional smaller ones, I would say have really learned a lesson from the pandemic. If I look at the global lines, the speed with which they changed their networks and got them stabilized, moving around Africa, and this is important, got their flows of empty containers in order as well, that was actually very swift, considering the nature of this. At the same time, we have seen a very rapid uptake across a lot of the Asian niche carriers in replacing the major carriers and at least providing some services going from Asia into the Red Sea. So what I'm seeing here is a shipping industry that was actually very well set up to handle this crisis. Now, of course, they were fortunate. Remember back 3 months ago, all we could talk about was massive overcapacity and how the carriers were loss-making. If it hadn't been for that overcapacity, the current situation would have been very, very different. But fact is, we have enough ships to deal with this, and the shipping lines, they dealt with it. If we were to look at places that were not as well geared, I actually want to pick up on something you mentioned there, Moritz, with, for example, some of the German companies being impacted. We see that across Europe. We see that to some degree also in the US. But that's not the shipping lines. That is actually the importers themselves. And what I have noticed, paradoxically, when we think back at the worst of the pandemic disruptions, a main focus point was, and I'm sure everybody remembers it, the talk was that this is not about just-in-time logistics. It's about just-in-case logistics, because everything is delayed. That led into a talk about, well, this is going to be a new framework for how to handle more resilient supply chains. Well, lo and behold, what happened in 2023? As container lines got enough ships, as we got through a lot of the problems, supply chains normalized, what did most importers do? They went back to just-in-time logistics, which means when the current issue hit them, they were just as ill-prepared as when the pandemic hit. Now, before this comes across as me just shooting at the importers for not necessarily learning a lesson, I would take it a step further and say, is there even a lesson to be learned? If you look at it from a micro perspective, let's say I did learn my lesson during the pandemic. So I do want a more resilient supply chain. I do want to plan for longer transit times and a higher stock level in my warehouses. If I did that, say in Germany, rest assured there would be a competitor that started a competing importing company with a more lean supply chain and lower costs than me. What am I then to do? And if we don't look at this the way we usually do, just with annual accounts, but look at this over a 10, 15, 20-year time frame, I would venture the view that it's perfectly okay we have these disruptions of the supply chains. Yes, it costs money right now. Sure, there might be a few jobs lost temporarily when the factories close down. But if we weigh that up against the savings we have in the overall economy over a 10, 15-year time frame from all the years where we don't have disruptions, over time, this might actually be the most economically viable setup. We will just have to live with these disruptions.
Mr. Abdurrahman, Dr. Maritz, have you got anything that you'd like to reflect on there from what Dr. Jensen has said?
I just have a question for you, Lars. Did I understand you correctly that disruptions once in a while are like, let's say, a disease to a healthy body as an update to the immune system? Or are you saying that the disruptions do not matter as much because we have so many stable years to weigh them against?
Rather the latter. Rather the latter. And here again, I think I strayed a little bit away from Michael's question because my focus right here was on especially the economies in Europe and in North America that can handle this. I think, Michael, you actually started out looking at the region where, if we look at, for example, Ethiopia, if we look at Sudan, to some degree also Jordan and Egypt, but Jordan and Egypt is certainly not in as bad a position as a Sudan and Ethiopia is. That is where we have a much, much larger problem, but that's a regional problem. I was about to say, in the more wealthy countries up here, it might actually over time be a better idea not to be as resilient as we think we should be, live with the added costs for a temporary while every once in a while, and that's not a disaster. We can handle it.
Perhaps something to add. Oh, sorry.
No, go on. After you, sir.
In terms of handling it, that is something that from the beginning, as the disruptions began, that these further ramifications have to be on the minds of policymakers in Europe as well. So I'm absolutely convinced that on the other side that initiated the conflict and disruptions, that these ramifications were factored in. So once Sudan or Ethiopia become unstable, that there will surely be actors ready to further this development into a direction which is favorable to their further political outlook and strategy in the region, as we've seen in other parts of the Sahel region.
Yeah, you can say my slightly cynical view on that is Ethiopia, if it's going to be destabilized what you saw in Sahel, nobody's going to come to the rescue. I think that's part of the sad reality as well, just as we are seeing in the rest of the Sahel countries.
Mr. Abdurrahman, again, looking at these kind of critical points, as it were, Ethiopia, and of course the and we've touched upon the notion of resiliency here. We've just mentioned that in Jordan we've just got the one key port. How should these how should the operators and the port authorities and the shipping industry view this then? Is it we'll have to suck it and see and let disruption happen, particularly where we have critical vulnerabilities with one port, or should we be doing more and try to be more resilient right now?
Well, in our situation, and of course, what Dr. Jensen has just said makes sense, as he said, in much richer countries in Europe and the US. However, in our case, I don't believe we have, I don't think we have the time to actually think about this because we're an importing country. Aqaba port is a destination port. We've got no transshipments going on in Aqaba, and we import much more than we export. The trade imbalance in Aqaba port is huge, and you can see this with the number of empty containers being evacuated from this port, just like any other importing country. So in our case, a 1 month, 2 months, even to 3 months challenges such as this Red Sea crisis will have huge ramifications on the Jordanian economy, which is actually still recovering from the COVID-19 days. Because even during the COVID-19 pandemic, the less, I would say, less lucky economies like Jordan and the region, and people, by the way, always mix up between the Middle East and let's say the other region countries, because in the Middle East, yes, it's much richer economies, but it's not the same situation over here in Jordan. So yes, those couple of months until today we're still maintaining, I would say, good resilience. However, in the next few months, especially after the Ramadan season, we're expecting to see huge impacts on consumer prices, on growth levels. We've already had the hit on tourism, which is the major. It's our main source of income for the country, which is tourism, which has actually stopped since the conflict that started back in October. So we're talking resilience over here is very important. And I do agree that the port has, the Jordan and the economies have learned from the pandemic. I still believe that the ports and authorities have a lot more to do. Maybe incentivize shipping lines to actually have more callings into the port by offering certain incentives. I don't know. I've seen a lot of ports around the world who might not be in a very regional, geographical position. However, they do have some transshipment volumes going on. So there's something that the port needs to do to actually provide more incentives to the shipping lines to ensure that they continue to call the port. And by the way, there's one important thing I would mention here is that we always hear port authorities saying that, yes, well, the volumes are still coming into the country. Well, this is good. However, we still need to make sure that the mother vessels and the main carriers are coming into the port, because that's a very huge, important indication for the investors who want to come to the country. It's a very important factor for doing business KPIs from the World Bank and so on. It's not only about the volumes.
Fantastic, thank you. And I mean, as a lot of what we're discussing now is kind of reflecting upon the adage of where there is risk, there's opportunity, and where there's opportunity, there's also risk. So if we're looking at challenges being felt at the global level and at an industry level, but at some areas these challenges are more acute as such, particularly in certain countries where there's less resiliency. At what point, what scenarios could present themselves that these challenges do again become a crisis level scenario? What are the scenarios we think that could occur in the next 12 months that could take this from a challenge to a crisis? And that's an open question to all three, and we'll start with Dr. Jensen.
Yeah, there is obviously you can always dream up a million different scary scenarios, but across the ones I would put in the bucket of being low likelihood, but definitely more than zero, and with extremely high impact. There are three I want to mention. One is the current conflict spreading to involve the Strait of Hormuz as well. This would be highly challenging. Again, I'm not addressing tankers. That's going to be an issue all on itself. But even from a container shipping perspective, keep in mind we can manage the current problem because we had enough overcapacity. But there is no more added capacity out there. So if you block off the Strait of Hormuz, that would impact a sizable volume of cargo, not only cargo to and from the Arabian Gulf, but it would also impact India directly because we have massive transshipment volumes in places like Geopolitics servicing India. This would immediately catapult us into crisis territory. That would be one. The other one that I also think is very much worth keeping in mind is the spectrum of a cyber attack, not against a shipping line, not against a country. The one that should keep everybody awake is a successful cyber attack against just the 4 or 5 largest transshipment ports in the world. If that was to happen, you would create massive problems. You would not be able to handle the mega vessels in those ports. That would de facto remove a large amount of shipping capacity overnight from the world. That would also lead to a crisis scenario. The third one, which I would put in the very, very low likelihood, but I'm going to put it out there because I was so surprised when I first saw it. The first mentioning of it, I honestly thought it was a joke. It stems back from late December, I think it was, where one of the Iranian military commanders was out with a warning that they might escalate this and do the same thing to the Strait of Gibraltar as they're doing in the Red Sea. And my immediate response was, these guys don't know a map. I mean, this makes zero sense until you look more closely at it. You have the Polisario movement in Algeria, which has been waging low-level war with Morocco for decades. They have been supplied with attack drones by the Iranians, the same attack drones that we see in the Houthis use, which means that launched from the northern shores of Algeria, this could be as problematic as what we see in the Red Sea. I would put it in very, very low likelihood, but with an extremely large impact should it happen.
Fab, thank you. Same question over to you, Dr. Mariritim.
I think a major challenge on if we say on the global level is from the perspective of Europe is that the current events lead to further distractions from the general bigger picture and focusing on just one part of a more, much more circumspect crisis, and thereby leaving gaps which are then exploited, deliberately used, the situation deliberately used to exploit gaps then left by Europe or the Americans, the West in general, and international attention with the backing of the resources of these major powers. So that could affect countries in Africa as much as in the Middle East. That's certainly something that can happen on the regional and local level for individual countries. As you mentioned earlier, Abdul Rahman, that the volume is still there and somebody steps into gaps being left because some shippers can no longer access ports. This can create future leverage and dependencies, monopolies being created. This is something that needs to be kept in mind. Shipping as an industry is highly geopolitical, and so it needs to be thought in a geopolitical way from the beginning. So whenever this happens, this needs to be kept in mind and needs to be politically addressed with other partners in order to have resilience in the future and not be left after the crisis is managed, come the fortunate day in the future. Then we'll sit there with a situation where all of a sudden things have realigned quietly in the background, where not just shipping or logistical chains have been disrupted, but entire business models and then economic, let's say, alignments, dependencies, so to speak, that can be used as leverage to actually achieve broader political effects to the detriment of the interests of the countries that are being such manipulated. So I think it's very important to keep an eye on this early on.
Fantastic, thank you. And Mr. Abdulrahman, what are the other scenarios potentially that we may have not mentioned so far that could take the challenges to a crisis level scenario?
Well, I would also add to what the gentlemen have just said, which, and by the way, I just read this yesterday, which is the rising tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia. So even if we're over with this Red Sea crisis and the Houthis attacking the vessels, if that ends up being another conflict in that region, so we're back to square one. So basically that area of the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is looking to continue to be a challenge to the Red Sea. That's number one. Number two, I would also echo what Dr. Jensen had just said about Gibraltar, because again, yesterday I was reading the how the problems between Algeria and Morocco have caught the carriers by surprise, which can easily escalate into another issue at that strait, which is by far the busiest, one of the busiest straits around the world. And I would say that the number three would be the spillover of more military action in the Red Sea, making it a 100% militarized region where you would never see a solution to that problem. And let me add one more point, which Dr. Braintree just mentioned. The fact that the shipping lines are missing in the Red Sea right now has actually allowed some small carriers from China, which we never knew about, enter the Red Sea area, and now they have regular calls to the port of Aqaba. Names that we've never heard of being in the industry for the past 21 years. I had to research them over Google and find out who they are and who they represent. And it's not easy finding any information about it. Now, again, would you be safe loading your cargo with that? Would you be allowed to do it? There's some compliance issues involved. You have to look into the ties of those shipping lines and who they represent. So that's another challenge for the volumes coming in if you want to bring them from China. However, I do feel for the importers in Jordan, they would look for any solution to help them overcome their challenges. So again, this is something, another risk that we have to look at in the next couple of months if the situation is not resolved.
Can I add a few comments on that one? First of all, the one you mentioned with Ethiopia and Somalia, I absolutely agree with that. I had the pleasure of being in Somalia just 2.5 months ago, and I would very much echo that, yes, once the government there is done fighting Al-Shabaab down south, you will likely see them engage in a new conflict against Somaliland, since they don't like the DP World facility that was built up there. That's the unfortunate part. But what the second part you're mentioning, we are skirting around. I was almost about to say the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room here is not any actors in the Middle East. The elephant in the room is China. I see China to a large degree reaping enormous benefits, not just from the current crisis, but from all the different local crises that we see all around the world. Every time we see a crisis around the world, it does two things. It tends to soak in Western military capabilities, which means that leaves China unimpeded, especially in the Taiwan Strait and in the South China Sea, as well as China's expansion throughout Africa. That is a major problem. And it also fuels what I think is, to some degree, an irreversible development. Is right now just a small underswell. If I look ahead, say 10, 20 years, my baseline is I expect to see a world where the notion of a global shipping line no longer exists. We are heading into a world where increasingly we have a multipolar world with the different power blocks trying to sanction each other. So the notion you can be a shipping line and service everybody globally is very slowly beginning to be eroded away. And I think what we see now in the Red Sea, with Chinese shipping lines being able to serve it, and by the way, you also have Omani shipping lines, Indian shipping lines, but you most manifestly do not have Western shipping lines able to do the same thing. This is just a beginning of a long-term change we're going to see.
I'm going to stray onto your 10 to 20 years kind of forecast in a moment. But before I do that, it's a really interesting point that we're making here, in that we've started off with geopolitics and the actors at a global level, the world players and what they're doing and how that has an influence and implications on the shipping industry, right? But there are other non-state actors, including the Houthis and others, that are able to exploit the situation, including things like criminals, etc. You know, in context of the disruption that is currently being felt in the industry, what are the other maybe threat actors, as it were, that are currently exploiting the situation in your view? And what should we be cognizant of in terms of how we can mitigate these threat actors for the industry? And let's start with Maritz.
Well, it's clearly a very broad question. I would rather recommend, rather than now, making a bucket list of who might at what point benefit from it, I think looking at each individual potential crisis, as you mentioned earlier, also Lars, that and you, Abdurrahman, with the approach of resilience and the ramifications of the disruptions, which are very sensitive points where it would make a lot of sense for an opponent who deliberately tries to dislodge the position of the West to attack next, and which let's say instruments can be used for that. So be that in Algeria, or be that in other parts of the world, be that in Somalia, there are many of these potential hotspots. And if combined with the traditional view of the world, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, the choke points, where are international shipping lines at very sensitive points anyway? Where is the system most easily disrupted with the greatest effect, and also to the greatest potential benefit to the adversary? And there are some of these possibilities then tied to non-state actors or state actors. And we've seen this with the Houthis, and there are other potentials here, as you mentioned. I think the West has to be much more ready and has to get up to speed to address these issues. There's more strength there than is oftentimes made up, which is also clearly visible. The warships do make a difference in the Red Sea. And the West can bring power to bear, but the problem is it has to spread its resources very thinly. And so we are already at a point where other states, which are being clearly targeted by propaganda, but also by other means, and clearly by economic leverage, including paramilitary force or military force, that these states look at the situation, have this holistic approach to it, and then make a decision early on before they find themselves in a worse situation, with more leverage being applied over them. So, and this is something when we are, coming back home basically here to South Africa. South Africa is a state that is, as a member of the BRICS, a very important player in the world, and one that has to navigate the situation with, as you mentioned, the elephant in the room, China and the West and Russia and Iran and the Houthis. Where does South Africa want to stand or find itself in 5 years, in 10 years? And which decisions have to be made now, or which doors have to be kept open so there's a favorable position for the country in 5 or 10 years? And that's something that brings me back to what I said in the beginning. I think the old ties, which are still there and which are very important, they need to be built on. We have to rejuvenate cooperation between Europe and many African countries, but especially South Africa. Germany and South Africa have had a long-standing partnership, and we need to build on this. And in fact, that's something that I think requires our commitment on many different levels. And the maritime sphere here is crucial and offers many opportunities between the potential, the economic resources, the innovation, and all the other human capital that's available in both countries. And it has to happen on eye level. And I think that's one of the greatest opportunities now, because the challenges are felt by everyone. So now we can drop many of the old reservations or imbalances and now meet on eye level and really make progress. I would love to see that.
Mr. Abdulrahman, do you see that there's a shared view on the challenges at a global level? There's a lot of reporting about the challenges being felt, but locally, do we perceive that in the same way, particularly in the region where you're sat today?
I don't believe so. And I don't blame them, because looking at it from a global level, yes, there are some challenges, maybe some delayed shipments, a little bit of increased prices, might be possible of a little bit of inflation. However, they don't see it from our perspective. So again, I don't believe that all the challenges have been being addressed properly at the global level. However, let me just go back to your question earlier before I go into my this question, because of course Dr. Blake is the expert on security. However, I still believe that there are, as he said, we don't want to actually name any groups or people, but the thing is, we believe that after the Red Sea crisis and what happened in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, anybody who has bad intentions, I would just simply put it, looking at how the situation has evolved in the past couple of months, now has the influence that, well, this works, we can do it anywhere else. So any group that might have some bad intentions to actually impact the global economy or have their own agenda or whatever can look at other straits now. Look at the Strait of Malacca. Look at as we said, the Gibraltar. Look at the Bosphorus Strait, for example, and other straits as well. So there's a huge challenge and risk over there. Another thing is, and I was just reading Dr. Jensen's post this morning about the possible attack on the internet cables under the sea, and that's a very huge risk. I don't know. The other day I was reading an IT consultant opinion on that, saying that it's kind of very difficult to do that. However, let's assume that this happens. Then where would we actually be right now? I don't think at this stage supply chain resilience would work, or any of those advanced technologies that we have been working on would work. We would probably go to primitive times where actually how shipping was being done historically, because now everything is being done digitally, as we say, and there's a huge surge towards digitalization. So that's another risk that we have to look at.
Thank you. I mean, Dr. Jensen, your name's come up and talk about in the context of non-state actors, right? And of course, what's happened potentially with the Red Sea and the internet cables there. Are there any other kind of non-nation state actors that you would want to flag at this point in time for the industry to be aware of and consider?
Let me be extremely provocative here and say, yes, there is one, let's call them non-state actor. I would point to the MAGA movement in the US as a major force for what is going to unfold as well. To the degree that you still have a US leaning towards, I wouldn't say supporting Trump, because eventually somebody else is going to replace him. It's the underlying movement here that's important. To the degree that they remain a force, that means you're going to see a US become ever more isolationistic. They will pull away from these conflicts, thereby increasing the power all of these other actors we talked about actually have in local conflict. Europe is not going to be able to step in and close the gap because Europe is completely tied down with currently the Russia-Ukraine conflict and then the potential for that one spreading. So one of the other very large, I would call them non-state actor because it's not a government as such, but that whole movement around the Make America Great Again can become extremely important on the global scene to the degree that the US is pulling back to their own continent.
So to bring this home a little bit to the audience that we have on the call today, we've spoken a lot about kind of Europe, Asia, and now across to the Americas with MAGA. And it's a good question to chat on this actually is, what are the impacts on the southern region in Africa, and how can South Africa leverage the current disruption and the disruption that is yet to come to make sure they're putting in the right controls and actions? That could be the relevant authorities, it could be the regulators, it could be operators. Start with you, Dr. Jensen.
Yeah, again, I'm going to do my level best to especially provoke the audience down here in South Africa, because my view on that is enormously bleak. I see a development across the continent. You got a few pockets that doesn't follow it, but I see a development across the continent where improvements in economy and all the wealth associated with it to a large degree does not benefit Africa. It benefits China, and the only other really large actor I see trying to get in there is Saudi Arabia, and I don't see that become a much better and happy story for many of the African countries. There has been significant build out of infrastructure and ports and what have you across the continent, but the value creation stemming from that largely does not benefit the countries in which they're built. It benefits China. And I unfortunately don't see a positive way out of that over the next 1 or 2 decades either.
Same question over to Dr. Mariritim. What are the implications here for South Africa, and what actions could be taken at this point in time?
I'm not as my outlook is not as bleak, but I definitely see the risk here, and it's already facts on the ground as you quoted them. This is already going on, and Europe is highly distracted by what's going on. But in Russia and Ukraine, but Europe has tremendous resources and has traditionally been active in Africa. But we've also seen in the course of these distractions and focusing on the challenge towards the east, that even France, that has traditionally been very strong in many parts of Africa, has withdrawn with military force, but also with its political engagement. So if we're now talking about a new way of cooperation between African countries and European countries, eye level means that both sides can initiate this. It's not, waiting for the Europeans to finally make up their minds and come back or reinvest and do more about African cooperation. I think it's really time to call for this kind of cooperation, to build resilience also from the local needs, to say, well, this is developing into a direction which we do not want to see in 5 or 10 years. We don't want to be critically dependent on foreign infrastructure built by China and financed with debt, which will then, make us hostage, hold us hostage to political leverage from abroad. We want to have alternatives. So Europeans, don't go away, don't be distracted, work with us. And there are tremendous opportunities. And there are many European countries, European companies, individuals that are very interested in that and still have strong ties. So it's not like there's nothing to build on. Much to the contrary. It's just important to focus on these opportunities and build on them. And it needs to be done now.
Hopefully it didn't come across as completely black and white. I mentioned there were a few pockets here and there. It's the overall picture that I'm pretty bleak on.
And I mean, Mr. Abdulrahman, from your perspective, what is it that, the implications look like for South Africa and what could be done? But also, do you see that same potential bleak outlook in your local region as well?
Well, first, the gentlemen have talked about South Africa and Africa and Europe on a macro level. I would just like to point out a couple of points about South Africa regarding the current situation. As Mr. Sonti correctly mentioned in one of his posts, is that South Africa did not really use this opportunity of the increased transits of vessels across the Cape of Good Hope properly because of the current challenge that they are facing. Whether there's a tax issue, I think, prop challenge currently going on, maybe the infrastructure. I've read that some bunkering terminals are not properly operated, not taking the opportunity of those transit vessels coming into the Cape of Good Hope. So maybe that's something else that they have to look at, especially that those crises happen suddenly. I mean, you're not really being notified before that happens. So you must be ready to actually seize the opportunity and use it to your favor, especially for the South African region. Another aspect that I would like to touch upon is the environmental problem, which is a huge risk at the moment for South Africa, especially if you do not have, as a region, proper environmental policies and regulations that would safeguard your oceans from the increased carbon emissions, or even a risk of what that might be a huge environmental issue, just like the ship that got struck on the Bab el-Mandeb, and now the oil is leaking across the region next to Yemen. So those are two issues that maybe South Africa needs to look at very closely. Now, back to your question regarding whether our area looks very bleak. I don't believe so. I always try to remain optimistic. We have overcome many challenges in the past. And even the figures that we currently see at Aqaba Port, even though they give you an indication that the situation is very difficult and challenging, yet it also gives you another indication is that we're still alive, which is a very good issue over here. Which this is very important, because no matter what's happening and what the challenges are going on, the shipping lines are still trying to find their way to Aqaba Port and the Red Sea in general, whether by implementing new services via feedering, or whether by implementing new services via Europe or the Mediterranean. So the interest is still there, which is very helpful. And again, our region still remains one of the most promising and growing regions in the world. So the interest will always remain there. So no, I'm not very pessimistic about it. I think this is a challenge that we have to overcome, and we can build on it again and learn from it, just as we have done in the pandemic days.
Thank you.
I might add a slight comment on that. I mean, the region you're up in has also, for many years, been very good at investing and upgrading infrastructure, especially when it comes to ports and terminals, at a point where you could, for every time it was built, say, well, you don't really need that. But the argument was always, well, there's going to be more business coming. That is not necessarily what you see in wider parts of the African continent. And especially if you look at South Africa, sure, this challenge came overnight, but the inefficiency and problems related to South African ports are definitely not new. They have been there for years, yet remained unaddressed, which means that when the situation drastically changes, that means that some of the port infrastructure up around the Middle East and also the Eastern Med are able to handle it. It costs money, it takes time, but there was a foundation there to handle a problem. That foundation has, on the other hand, been undermined in parts of Africa, not maintained and not invested into.
So what's quite interesting here is that, whilst we're saying that we're facing challenges, right, there are, of course, some areas that are facing much more acute challenges, but the outlook is still very bleak. Do we believe that we're heading towards a crisis that we can see coming towards us like a train, or are we just going to continue experiencing increasing pressure within these challenges? And with that, how do we approach the increasing challenges? What do we do in South Africa, or do we just prepare for crisis and suck it and see for the foreseeable future? I will start with Dr. Jensen on that one, right? Because you've thrown the bleak one out there.
I've thrown the bleak one out. Yeah, exactly. I'm actually going to build on that. Was actually what Maurice was mentioning earlier, with South Africa being part of BRICS, which of course means it is an odd collection of countries that they are trying to collaborate with all at the same time. And if I put that in context of what I also mentioned earlier, we're increasingly heading in to a multipolar world where you cannot necessarily be aligned with all the poles at the same time. It's going to be crunch time. Who do you want to ally yourself with? And it's not a situation I'm happy about. I'm a dinosaur. I mean, I'm a child of the Cold War, back when you also had to choose your allegiances as countries. Unfortunately, I see a world that is going to be more difficult than the Cold War. At least in the Cold War, you only had to say, well, which one of the two poles do I need to align with? Now, across that region, it's going to be much more complex. And that's a difficult one. But I still think a lot of countries are going to be forced to choose who do you want to ally yourself with.
Moritz, I'm sure you're chomping at the bit to come back on that one from a geopolitical perspective. What's your view there? And should we be aligning ourselves within the industry, which is a private industry, right, or not?
I would like to add to what Lars just said. It's not just a question of where you align yourself with, or whom do you want to align yourself with. It's actually a situation where many countries are going to be aligned by someone else. And so in order to keep the possibilities open, to have a real choice, to still have the sovereignty to act, actions have to be taken. So in order to keep doors open in coming years, it's important to start balancing influence and instruments that are being applied against you as leverage of power, and make sure that you're not depending on these influences critically early on. So even, and that's of course the situation for many smaller countries. If you don't have much choice, then you take whatever you can get. If there's only one shipping company that comes to your ports, well, you can't just say, well, we're not having you. But the point is that you need to address this fact with all the others that could potentially help you. That's one thing. But there's also, when it comes to optimism or something that may result from the current situation, attacking merchant ships with cruise missiles is a very ham-fisted way of influencing global politics. This is something that's going on and everybody can see it. This is not something, if you think about it twice, that you want to happen on your side of the game. So I think it also is an opportunity for many of those that are perhaps undecided or what are critically appraising the policies of the West in the past decades, who can still say, well, what's going on here should set me on alert mode to not fall into the hands of the wrong geopolitical side. So maybe this is also a wake-up call to many to say, oh, here's clearly a line here between Houthis, Iran, and Russia is being supported by China. China is benefiting from the current situation. Do I want to critically depend on a country that exploits something as this? So maybe this is a wake-up call that benefits a general rethink in countries in Africa and also in the Middle East. And another, on a, let's say, a more technical level, whatever we need to do now, and we have to get underway to deal with these manifold potential maritime security crises, the means in the hands of so many malign actors, as you pointed out, Abdulrahman, that make it very easy to attack shipping and disrupt global supply chains, that will have to require some sort of a response, and one that doesn't always require sending Euro warships firing €2 million missiles at $2,000 drones to deal with it. So there's going to be some sort of a system which will handle this. I'm very sure, and we're working on this. But once we have this, it will have follow-on, just bycatch effects, basically, which are more than just tiny side effects. The sea has always had this quality of allowing for lawless spaces, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, all of these things which are major issues also in the waters of Southern Africa. So if we have these systems in place that can deal with attacks on shipping in the Red Sea or in the Strait of Gibraltar or wherever it is needed, and it's going to be needed, we have systems that are readily available to deal with illegal fishing off the coast of South Africa. And that's something that needs to be dealt with. It's not just a tiny problem, it's a big problem, costing billions of euros every year and ruining the environment and the prospects of the future for the current and coming generations. So I think there is a lot of potential here, but we have to seize it and develop it and make progress.
Mr. Abdulrahman, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think most of the points have been covered, but I would echo what the gentlemen have just said, because here in Jordan, we actually totally understand the challenges associated of who you're aligned with, because Jordan has always been trying to, let's say, tread carefully across the region and ensure that they are actually always in the middle, because we are in the middle of the region. So, and any alliance that we would go for would have huge impacts on our economic outlook, on our development, and our daily lives. So we have been through this challenge before, and I think we've been very successful trying to balance across the alliances around us. But as Dr. Jensen has just mentioned, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that, especially with a multipolar world these days.
Yeah, can I add one bit on that? Because I definitely like your view also, Morris. It's not always you have a choice. It might be chosen for you. And of course, there are many ways of, let's call it country-to-country blackmail. Part of that is threatening somebody with war. More subtle, which is what I would see in Africa, is the economic stranglehold of building infrastructure. Now you owe a lot of money. But to give a shipping-related example, almost a decade ago, all the headlines were about a Nicaragua canal. A Nicaragua canal was going to be built. I actually was invited over to look at part of the project, ended up concluding this makes no sense. There is no way you could make a positive business case out of building a Nicaragua canal, not even in a 100-year perspective. Sure, it would be great for the shipping lines. They would just play Nicaragua against Panama, but basically the whole idea seemed stupid, to put it bluntly. And I left from there just with the feeling that there's something going on here. I don't quite know what it is. A few years later, Panama, the Panamanian government then announced they would no longer recognize Taiwan as an independent country. And suddenly all talk about Chinese paying for a Nicaragua canal disappeared. This was under threat that, fine, we will just build the canal. It might cost us $100 billion. Who cares? But Panama, you're going to go bankrupt unless you do X. That's part of what I also see unfold.
On that note, gentlemen, if we were to hold this webinar again in a year's time, do we think that we'd be facing the same challenges, or do you think we'd be in a better position or a worse position? And how can we within the industry, particularly in South Africa, try to prepare ourselves to get into that best position over the next year? So we're talking a lot about the far-flung future, but what can we do now for the next year ahead to make sure that if we were to hold this webinar in a year's time, things are a little bit better and a little bit less bleak, potentially? Dr. Jan.
Should I take first crack at it? For South Africa specifically, if I was down there, the first thing I would focus on, how can you get your major container terminals improved in efficiency very, very rapidly? For two reasons. First of all, if we continue to have to go around Africa and not use the Suez routing, there are opportunities to get South Africa better connected to trade networks, but that's not going to happen with the state the ports are in right now. Longer term, not only would it be resilient if we had the disruption again, but let's say, just for sake of argument, the Red Sea crisis was solved tomorrow. Everybody goes back to Suez. We would still have crazy overcapacity. So the shipping lines would have a very strong incentive to actually continue to go around Africa on the backhaul where the cargo is not time sensitive. So there would still be these opportunities to tap into the global networks. And furthermore, and given South Africa's location, this might not be very high up the agenda. The European carbon tax on shipping plays into this, because I have to pay carbon tax on the journey from my last non-EU port to my first EU port. Going around Africa, that is colossally expensive. That's going to be even more expensive when the tax levels are ramped up. Having the ability to efficiently tell the lines, you can actually make a call here without the vessel getting snagged for I don't know how long, would massively cut the CO2 emissions tax bill, also for the carriers. I see a significant opportunity there, but it does require a whole different level of efficiency, reliable efficiency in those ports.
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Mariritim, again, looking towards if we were to hold this webinar in a year's time, would things have improved or would they not? And indeed, how can we set ourselves up in South Africa to make sure we're in the best possible position?
I would love to see that people now seize on the opportunity that the European focus has shifted towards the Cape again. And with shipping lines passing by South Africa, then actually stopping and turning South Africa into an important hub, as you described, Lars, I think there are not just shipping opportunities, but overall economic opportunities here in cooperating more closely. There's so much potential here and so much of a need with the reformation of the geopolitical landscape that Europe is going to need African partners. And many European players have already realized this. But if the doors are open and the opportunities are being seized upon by both sides, there's a lot of potential here. So I'd love to see in a year's time that we have a lot of that going on already. And on a very personal level, a friend of mine, Stefan Bülow, he's moved to Cape Town a few years ago to start one of his dream projects, and that was getting the vessel Egalis from the South African government and turning it back into a research vessel. He's been a captain on a research vessel before, German mariner, and so he's building something in South Africa with in mind to actually train South Africans to be part of the global maritime industry, and thereby benefit the overall efforts of everyone and the needs of everyone. So I think there is, just on the very individual level here, there are opportunities to further German-South African maritime cooperation with projects like this in education, training, business, using the same time zone, good internet connection, and the shipping routes which are there. Physical, industrial capacities, raw materials, innovation, and human capital. I think all the ingredients are there. In 1 year's time, I hope to see that this is being seized upon.
Do you have the same outlook, Mr. Abdurrahman, a positive outlook or more pressures in the next year?
I would choose to disagree this time because I think we have a lot in common with South Africa, and usually those challenges need to have a rapid response, and you need to address them very quickly in order to be ready in 1 year's time. Our experience shows that we do not learn from those opportunities, and I believe that by 1 year's time they would still not be ready because there's really not a lot of indications across, let's say, the industry that this is going to happen, or that they would take the opportunity, just like what happens in our region as well. So I would say that in 1 year's time, I believe, I hope that the Red Sea challenge would be over, and by the time it's over, then things will be back to normal. I remember at the COVID-19 days, they used to say that the just-in-time delivery would stop because people are not going to use it anymore because of what happened in the COVID-19. Look now, after the pandemic has been over, everybody's back to just-in-time delivery because that was the normal way of doing it, or let's say the easiest way to do it, or that's how they learned to do it. But hopefully, I might be wrong.
And you can say in terms of pointing at opportunities also for, I would say, both South but also East Africa in this case. One of the elements we haven't even touched upon is where is the global growth? Again, I'm looking specifically from the container perspective. Where is that? It is in what I would tend to call the Indian Ocean Rim. If I look at trade growth over the last year, we have a very clear tendency that it is not China and Far East that grows the most. It's the Indian subcontinent, Middle East. And part of that is this very, very slow China plus one movement. It doesn't mean everybody's moving out of China overnight. That would be physically impossible. It's a slow movement. But the growth locus for a lot of the trade is going to be centered around the Indian Ocean, which again breeds opportunities, not just for South Africa, but for East Africa as well.
Thank you. And so on that note, right, is there anything else that we've maybe not had the time to cover off on today during the webinar that you would like to bring up to Dr. Lars's point then? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to, raise to the awareness of the audience that we have with us today?
No, even I think it's more common than anything else. One thing we haven't touched upon, apart from a small side comment, is all these targets on the environmental performance and emissions reductions. And of course, I cannot speak for anybody else here on the planet. The way I see it is I find it unrealistic that we as a global industry, and here I'm thinking about shipping, will meet the targets that have been laid forth. It's unrealistic. We will meet the targets that everybody talked about at COP28, but we have a political environment where no company can go out and say this because they would be crucified immediately. So we have a discrepancy here between aspirations and what the physical reality is. And in this, I'm actually not pointing so much at the shipping lines. I see shipping lines have a relatively high willingness to invest also in green ships. I see two choke points though. One choke point is how quickly can we build the facilities to physically make enough green fuel? And sure, we have facilities that are making a few tens of thousands of tons. For container ship, or rather for shipping alone, we need 800 million tons. And then aviation needs it as well. It is unrealistic we'll build enough facilities in the time frame required. The other choke point are the shippers, the customers themselves. I see a very, very, very low willingness to pay for this. So to me, one of the good indications is when the Red Sea crisis broke out, that's almost 3 months ago now, 2.5 months ago, we have to go around Africa, yet there is no interest neither from shipping lines, nor from politicians, nor from importers to discuss what is the impact of emissions. I think that is also very telling in terms of this discrepancy between what are all the nice things that everybody is saying and what physically is actually going to happen.
Thank you very much. I mean, Dr. Maritz, is there anything else that you'd want to add to Dr. Jensen's comment there, or indeed, is there anything else that you think we may have not had the time to touch upon today that you'd like to raise for awareness for the audience?
I think there's something that affects this audience here, even though I'm not aware of the composition, exact composition, how many people here have been drawn to this, but formerly have not paid much attention to shipping topics. But I think that this crisis and the developments over the past decades, culminating here again in these high geopolitical tensions which play themselves out at sea, will lead to a much, much greater awareness of maritime affairs. And maritime affairs are global affairs, are human affairs. We all depend on the sea. 70% of the ocean is covered by the sea, of the globe is covered by the sea. And humanity, for its survival, depends on how we manage these oceans. They are not a vast, endless resource that we can exploit to our will. We need to manage how we do this in a sustainable way in order to have a future for us as a species on this planet. So I think in a very, very large and long-term view, this is another crisis which can add to this awareness and actually make people all over the world more aware of the need to protect our oceans and invest in maritime security in the sense of protecting what we have out there that we so critically depend on.
Thank you very much. Mr. Abdurrahman, anything you'd like to add to that, or indeed anything that you think we may have not the time to cover off on today?
I just want to add that maybe we haven't touched upon this subject a lot during our conversation, but it's very important, which is the rise of piracy again because of what's going on in the Red Sea situation, which is also another, I would say, influencer for other pirate groups to actually go get back into business, which is going to be another risk that we have to tackle in the future. Another very important risk that we have to look at, which picks up upon the human factor that Dr. Blake just mentioned, which is cruise ships. And cruise ships is a huge risk when you look at those conflicts going on in those choke points, maritime routes around the world. So imagine a ship carrying 3,000 people that could be attacked in one of those straits. Of course, we're not trying to make everybody scared about getting on cruise ships in the future, but it is a possible risk that cruise ships might have to look at and globally also address, because that's another aspect that we're looking at. For example, I've just noticed that in Jordan over here, we had this new cruise terminal open in Aqaba, and out of 110 cruise itineraries and cruise calls booked at the port, almost 85 have been canceled already. So you see how the human risk is a very important factor over here.
Thank you very much. I'm starting to get conscious of time. We've got about 9 minutes and less left. And with that in mind, I've been having a little look at the questions as they've been coming through into the Teams chat. And I think for the most part, we've been able to answer the majority of them. Not to labour the point too much on the geopolitical side of the life and relying on the actions of others as such, but there is a good question that's coming through from Diana in the last minute or so, which is South Africa's key position in supplying energy for Europe's energy transition, coupled with South Africa's capabilities in manufacturing essential for the economic transformation of both Europe and the other region. Is the current crisis not underrated? Are we not playing this down a bit too much by calling this a challenge and not so much an emerging crisis? And how should the international community respond to make sure these opportunities are not lost? So in short, are we not downplaying this today in what is an emerging crisis tomorrow? And then, you know, how do we feel the international community should be responding here?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Let me put it that way. You're on mute, Michael.
Apologies, I muted myself today to talk. So I think the question is getting towards the point of, you know, are we downplaying the current crisis, and by calling it challenges instead of confronting this as an emerging crisis? Is it crisis for just calling it something different? And how should the international community be responding to the situation to make sure that this challenge or the crisis does not risk opportunities in the future?
That is true. I mean, it is a choice. I mean, I was one of the ones that are downplaying this one and saying it's not a disaster, it's a challenge that can be managed. But of course, it depends a bit on perspective. As we could also hear from Abdul Rahman, this is closer to a crisis in Jordan than it is, for example, up here in Denmark or in US or in Germany or in other places. So to some degree, it's a matter of perspective. There are, from a global perspective, no, this is not a crisis, but there are pockets that are clearly hit by a crisis. What should we do against it? This is where it really becomes problematic. We haven't even touched very much on that. But I'm increasingly seeing a political undercurrent, not just in the US, but also in Europe. From the perspective, why should we even send our Navy down there? What are they doing there? Because we can service if we can service fine by going around Africa, let's pull the military back and leave this as a regional fight. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that view. That has a lot of other very negative ramifications if we go down that path. But it is a beginning underlying current that can create other problems.
Other Marines?
I agree with Lars, and I also agree with Diana, who asked the question. I think we have to be very much aware that when we look at the situation in the Red Sea as a challenge to be managed, that we must not forget that we're overall facing a major global crisis, of which the situation in the Red Sea is just one facet. So we mustn't overstate the situation in the Red Sea to forget the overview, not to be obstructing our view on the global crisis. So the situation that we are facing here, just to remind ourselves, is we have a nuclear-armed major power waging war in Europe, using nuclear weapons, and you said Denmark, leveraging this nuclear arsenal to get political gains in its conversations, in its negotiations with other countries, including Denmark. We are facing not just a hot war going on, but a very, very big risk of this escalating further. So we have a major crisis already going on. And as mentioned before, there is a direct link between Russia, Iran, and the Houthis. There is China backing Russia. There is China benefiting from the situation. There's a global power shift underway and a challenge and a multipolar system, which is already entering into a very hot form of competition, which will concern all countries involved, all countries in the world. So we have to now not let good opportunities slip through our fingers. So yes, this is urgent. We have to see this as a moment of crisis in which we need to act. We can't just sit idly by and let opportunities pass. So that definitely I would like to reinforce here. We need to seize on these opportunities here. And South Africa definitely has tremendous opportunities when it comes to European cooperation for both sides.
But you can say it's also always a matter of framing. What is the opportunity to solve? What is the crisis we are trying to solve? Because you can go from the micro one. The crisis we are trying to solve is to get the Houthis to stop shooting missiles at ships. That would be one way of looking at it. Some will argue, well, if just we push Israel to back out of Gaza, they will stop. The next level up is this seems to be an effort from Iran to destabilize the region. It could be framed in that. How do we address that problem? But you can take it a step further up. Sending navies to the Red Sea, at least I think that's part of the way it should be framed, is fighting to uphold the principle of free navigation on the oceans. Because if we give away that one, we could say, well, let's just leave it as a regional fight. This will come back to bite us with the Chinese in the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan all of a sudden. So there's a lot of stake. So the opportunity is also, how do we address this before it spirals completely out of control?
Thank you very much. Abdurrahman, have you got anything to add to that one? Or indeed, if not, you said something at the top of the call that I am now going to pick at because we've got that final 3 minutes on the clock, right? And you said that, we need to look towards the resolution of the current challenges. How does this situation resolve itself? And indeed, is there anything that the industry can do to play a part in that resolution?
Well, not to really to tread into the political minefield, I would say, but let's start by ending the war. Yes, let's take those people up to their words, and if that's what they claim, and let's stop the war. And it's much cheaper than sending those military crafts to the Red Sea. It's just much cheaper, and you save a lot of people's lives by ending the war. So let's try this as a first step. Number two, as Dr. Jensen just said, it differs from different perspectives. For example, there's a huge difference between saying my container will be delayed than my container will never arrive. So the way you look at it is quite different, whether it's a crisis or a challenge. But right now, and I'm not a political expert, but the way I see it, that there's no really resolution let's wait until the war is over and we see what happens. And then we can look up at new resolutions and find out whether they were really doing that for a reason or there's another agenda behind that.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you all for joining today. I'm going to hand back over to Inathi now, but thank you all for your time and your enthusiasm in today's discussion.
Thank you,
Mr.
Evans. Thank you, and thank you to Dr. Break. Thank you, Mr. Ali and Dr. Jensen.
Thank you
for your inputs on today's session, and thank you everyone for joining. And I think we would all agree that we were able, to tackle what we were hoping to address with the 5 points around the impact of the sea routes, disruptions on logistics and international sea trade, the Red Sea case, the impact on cost of living as shipping rates, are rising, the importance of maritime security in an uncertain world, the future of shipping routes and the Cape of Good Hope as an alternative, and the last one, which talked to the price of, doing business amid all shipping challenges and the effects of the geopolitics on maritime transport. And I think we were able to address all of those. And we thank all our guest speakers and our moderator for being able to take us through that. And I'm hoping that all the questions that were put on the site as well, indeed, they were addressed. And I also want to thank the corporate members within the chamber that enables the chamber to be able to continue its advocacy and lobby work, across the country, the continent, and, internationally, as we are hoping to operate in that space as well. With those words, thank you, everyone. We look forward to another session that we'll have in the near future. And Dr. Break, we welcome you. As you said, you will be coming down to South Africa around March. We look forward to hosting you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye.